I went to the hotel that night. I spent hours in bed rolling that over in my head. Somebody's lying. Is it Marina? What language was Marina and he talking? My God, English. And then, of course, the question would be, where the hell did a 19-year-old girl in the middle of Russia learn to speak English? KGB. That's enough for me. They were speaking English in Russia, not Russian. Let me tell you, she was KGB. A great deal of the documentation found in the Warren volumes and at the National Archives does not tell us what occurred either before or during the assassination of President Kennedy. During the past 50 years, we have learned that many of these documents were either altered, fabricated, or simply created in order to incriminate Lee Harvey Oswald as the assassin to the exclusion of everyone else. The statements of witnesses, as recorded in FBI reports, were often not what those witnesses told the FBI. First-hand accounts of many witnesses who knew and spent a considerable amount of time with Oswald were never asked to testify before the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, or the Assassination Records Review Board. Testimony from Oswald's own brothers, Robert Oswald and John Pick, as to his identity and whereabouts was often ignored. When Lee Harvey Oswald's own brother is shown a photograph of Oswald, on two separate occasions he says, "That's not my brother," doesn't that raise some kind of a question? Well, if it isn't your brother, who is it? And the commission just ignored it. When we examine and interview those same witnesses, read their statements, and look at the documents and evidence used by the commission, a very different story emerges. Or what does it mean to anyone when, within hours of the assassination, the FBI suddenly knows where Oswald was working when he was 16 years old, where Oswald went to junior high when he was 14 years old, and they send agents to get those school records? So what does that mean? To me, it means that the FBI had prior knowledge. Dozens and dozens of items of evidence were used to incriminate Oswald, but many of these items were not found by the Dallas police, and their origin is unknown. Time and time again, we see that original documents were destroyed while in FBI custody. We see that FBI agents were knowingly sent to collect information and documents from erroneous sources. And, believe it or not, the FBI gave very, very few documents to the Warren Commission, original documents. Nearly all the documents given to the Commission were either paper copies or photographs of documents. And nearly all original documents collected by the FBI were destroyed while in their custody. The alteration, fabrication, and disappearance of evidence began within hours of the assassination. The overwhelming problem faced by J. Edgar Hoover was to immediately disguise and cover up the existence of two Oswalds. One of these young men was born in New Orleans in 1939 and given the name Lee Harvey Oswald. Throughout his young life, Lee was husky, well-built, and often the tallest boy in his classroom. Lee Oswald had an older brother named Robert Oswald and an older half-brother named John Pick. Lee Oswald's mother was a tall, well-dressed, nice-looking woman. The other young man, he was small, thin, and appeared to be underfed. He was raised and cared for by a short, heavy-set, unfriendly woman I call the Marguerite Oswald imposter. But this young man had one very important quality that would eventually prove useful to our intelligence agencies. He spoke, read, and understood the Russian language. In 1947, Walter and Georgia Bell were building their home on San Saba Street in Benbrook, just outside of Fort Worth. The FBI interviewed Georgia Bell and reported that the Oswalds lived across the street in 1948. I met Georgia Bell in the 1990s and showed her the FBI report. Georgia said, "That's not what I told them. I told them Mrs. Oswald lived at that house in 1947, not 1948. Georgia remembered Marguerite Oswald as short and fat. Marguerite didn't have a car and would often ask Lucille Hubbard, or me, to drive her to the store and to other places. One time Lucille drove her to a house next to Stripling School, where she had lots of furniture and clothes. Now this house, located at 2220 Thomas Place, is significant. The short, fat Marguerite Oswald lived there in 1947, in 1954, and again in 1963 when President Kennedy was assassinated. Now, people are probably wondering why the year 1947 is relevant, 16 years before the assassination. It is relevant because Lee Oswald's older brother, John Pick, said they never lived in a house on San Saba. Pick told the Warren Commission, "I don't know nothing about San Saba." In the summer of 1947, John Pick, his mother, and brothers Robert and Lee Oswald were living at 1505 8th Avenue in Fort Worth. Lee was in the first grade at Lily Clayton Elementary School. In June, John Pick got a summer job, at the Tex Gold Ice Cream Parlor 5 blocks south of their home, and was soon promoted to assistant manager. Robert Oswald discussed family matters in detail during his Warren Commission testimony. But when asked about the summer of 1947, Commission member Allen Dulles, former director of the CIA, asked for an adjournment. Dulles was likely concerned that Robert, like John Pick, would say that his family was living at 1505 8th Avenue during the summer of 1947, which would conflict with a second Oswald family living at 101 San Saba at the same time. After the adjournment, Robert Oswald's testimony resumed, and he was questioned about events that occurred in 1948. No questions were asked about the summer of 1947. The Warren Commission ignored John Pick and avoided asking Robert Oswald questions about where the family was living in 1947. The FBI changed the date that Georgia Bell said the Oswalds lived across the street from 1947 to 1948. The Commission accepted the FBI report and concluded the Oswalds had lived at San Saba in 1948, and thereby avoided the problem of 2 Oswald families living in 2 different locations at the same time. The story of the Oswald family living in 2 different places in 1947 is just the beginning. There are dozens of such examples which can take a great deal of time and effort to examine and understand. But when pieced together year after year, the undeniable fact is there were 2 young boys, and later 2 young men, who used the name Lee Harvey Oswald. Dates and details, again and again, year after year, can be very dull and tedious. But the devil's in the details, and these details are the only way to follow the lives of these 2 people. A close examination of how they were able to merge the identities of these 2 young boys demonstrates both the FBI's knowledge and their involvement in the cover-up. During his Warren Commission testimony, John Pick said that Lee was enrolled in a school between 89th and 90th Streets and between 2nd and 3rd Avenue, only a couple of blocks from Pick's apartment. Robert Oswald, who visited his mother and brother when they lived in New York City, said, quote, "Lee entered the 8th grade at Public School 44 on Columbus Avenue at 76th Street, which is 2.5 miles from the Pick's apartment." Now, both John Pick and Robert Oswald said Lee Oswald, their brother, attended junior high school in Manhattan, but the FBI and Warren Commission ignored both of their brothers. Instead of checking into this Manhattan school record, the FBI gave the Warren Commission photographic copies of Oswald's school records in the Bronx, but never in Manhattan, as reported by John Pick and Robert Oswald. Mrs. Dorrit Wolfe was an art teacher in Public School 117 in the Bronx, and she remembered young Oswald as one of her 7th grade students. She described him as very small, introverted, very intelligent, and said that he constantly truanted. This was Harvey Oswald, very different from John Pick's brother, the tall, husky, well-built Lee Oswald, who lived with Pick and his wife when they first arrived in New York. Harvey Oswald's truancy came to the attention of the Bureau of Attendance. On March 12th, a petition for delinquency was filed, and on April 15th, Oswald was adjudged a school truant. The following day, he was arrested and taken to domestic relations court and remanded to the youth house until May 7th. At youth house, Harvey Oswald scored 118 on an IQ test, considerably higher than the IQ of 102 that Lee Oswald received in Fort Worth a year earlier. The young boy in youth house was obviously Harvey Oswald. Harvey Oswald told Dr. Kurian that he never went to school, but on occasion his brother would substitute for him and take his place in school. But at this time his older brother was in the Marines, and brother John Pick was married and in the Coast Guard. When Harvey Oswald told Dr. Kieran that his brother sometimes took his place in school, could he have been referring to Lee Oswald? With the two school records for Harvey and Lee merged together, it was easy to see that Lee Oswald attended public school full-time. But how to account for Harvey Oswald's chronic truancy on the same school record? The FBI provided photographs of the public school 44 school records to the commission, but all of the New York school records, the original records, disappeared while in FBI custody. There's a 6th grade classroom photograph taken of Lee Oswald in 1952 in Fort Worth. A year later, Robert Oswald took a photograph of the young, small, slender Harvey at the Bronx Zoo. But when the Warren Commission showed the Bronx Zoo photo to John Pick, he replied, "Sir, from that photo, I could not recognize that that is Lee Harvey Oswald." John Pick refused to identify Harvey Oswald as his brother. Pick told the commission, under oath, that the boy in the photo was not his brother, but nobody listened. I telephoned John Pick in Lynn Haven, Florida, and asked him about his refusal to identify Harvey Oswald as his brother. Pick replied, "I gave my testimony to the Warren Commission. I stand by that and have nothing further to say." I would like to share a bit of information about Harvey Oswald's short, heavy-set caretaker. The Margaret Oswald imposter did her best to find employment where she could be paid in cash. She avoided providing a Social Security number, avoided being subjected to withholding tax, and avoided credit bureaus. She did everything she could to avoid creating duplicate records for Margaret Oswald. It should come as no surprise that Margaret Oswald's federal income tax returns remain classified to this day. While Harvey Oswald was at Youth House, John Caro interviewed the short, heavy-set Margaret Oswald imposter. This Marguerite told Caro that Oswald's father died at age 45, when in fact he died at age 42. She said that she was married on July 19, 1929, when in fact Margaret Clavery and Robert E. Lee Oswald were married on July 15, 1933, and it was a second marriage for both. She gave an incorrect date for Oswald's birthday, and then mistakenly identified her sister as Lillian Segore, when in fact her sister's name was Lillian Moret. This impostor told Caro that her son was baptized at the Trinity Lutheran Church, but Lee Oswald was baptized at the Redeemer Lutheran Church in New Orleans. These are just a few of the errors made by the Margaret Oswald impostor during her interview with John Caro. The Margaret Oswald impostor made many, many errors that the real Margaret Oswald would never have made. Going into an interview with a probation officer, you really have no idea what they're going to ask, although you could suspect they were going to ask information about a background. She knew, apparently from the interview, that Lee Oswald was born in New Orleans. He was Lutheran. She was married before. His father died when he was young. She knew some of it. She just didn't know the details. I'll tell you something you might find very interesting in Margaret Oswald's testimony. She was reading from notes about her background during her testimony, and she even states that. Excuse me, I think I've got that in my notes somewhere here. And my notes were given to me by I can't remember the guy's name, but he worked for Life magazine. Some guy had compiled notes on Margaret Oswald's background and Lee Harvey Oswald's background and given them to her before she testified. In January 1954, Harvey Oswald enrolled as a full-time student. He walked into Myra DeRuse's 8th grade homeroom in the basement cafeteria, and she remembered the day she met young Oswald. Myra told me, "Well, the first day I came into my homeroom, he handed me his file. When I read his name was Lee Harvey Oswald, I said to him, 'How do you want to be called?' He told me to call him Harvey, so I always called him Harvey. I only knew him as Harvey." After listening to Myra again and again call him Harvey, 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 I began referring to the smaller, thinner, quiet Oswald as Harvey. Myra described young Harvey as a little scrawny fellow, skinny and quiet. He came to the middle of my chest, about 4'6" tall, and didn't have an ounce of fight in him. Myra saw Harvey nearly every day before school, sitting on the front steps, waiting for the school to open, and thought he was lonely. Myra saw Harvey every day in her homeroom class, in the school library, and after school riding bicycles on the school grounds with Ed Vobel. On one occasion, after school, Ed Vobel ran up to Myra and shouted, Mr. Roos, come quick, come quick. A piano fell on Harvey. Myra and fellow teacher Dorothy Duvik followed Vobel into the basement cafeteria and found Harvey on the floor with a small upright piano laying across his legs. Myra drove Harvey to the Monolepry Clinic on Canal Street. After examination by a physician, Myra drove Harvey to his home on Exchange Alley. He asked where his mother was. Harvey replied, she's working at the bar. Lee Oswald and his tall, nice-looking mother were living at 1454 St. Mary Street. The apartment building was owned by Julian and Myrtle Evans, who had known the tall, nice-looking Marguerite Oswald for over 20 years. Julian Evans told the Warren Commission that Marguerite Oswald, quote, was a beautiful woman with black hair, a real fashion plate, who dressed beautifully. But when Mr. Evans saw the short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald imposter following the assassination on television, he said, when we saw her on television just recently, after all this happened, she looked just awful. You wouldn't have recognized her if they hadn't told you who she was. She looked that different. In the spring of 1954, as strange as it may seem, the short, quiet Harvey Oswald and the much taller, huskier Lee Oswald both attended Beauregard Junior High during the spring of 1954. I showed Myra the photo of Harvey Oswald taken at the Bronx Zoo in 1953 in New York. She said, that's him, just like I remember him. I then showed Myra a photo Ray taken at Beauregard that appeared in Life magazine. Myra looked at the photo a long time and then said, that's not Harvey. That's not the boy from my homeroom. Look at this boy. He looks like a football player, and Harvey was skinny. After school ended in June, Myra never saw Harvey again. In October, the tall, husky, well-built Lee Oswald got into a fight with Johnny Newmeyer and Mike Newmeyer. Ed Vobel witnessed the fight and then helped clean up Lee Oswald. A few days later, Ed Vobel was with Lee Oswald on the steps of Beauregard when a young man named Robin Riley punched Lee in the mouth, cutting his lip badly. Once again, Vobel helped clean up Lee Oswald, and their friendship began to develop. 7 months later, in May 1955, Vobel attended a pre-high school conference with Lee Oswald at Warren Easton High School. As their friendship developed, Vobel began visiting Oswald's mother, who he described as tall and nice-looking. After the assassination, Vobel saw the Marguerite Oswald imposter's photo on TV and in the newspaper. He told the Warren Commission, I had a picture in my mind which was very different from what I saw her in the papers after all this happened. I didn't recognize her. Vobel didn't recognize the Marguerite Oswald imposter as the nice-looking mother of Lee Oswald. A month later, in June 1955, Vobel and Lee began to attend Civil Air Patrol meetings. Ed Vobel was one of the only few people who knew both Harvey and Lee. He died very unexpectedly at the young age of 31 at the Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans. Harvey Oswald's junior high school records from Stripling were confiscated by the FBI within 20 hours of the assassination and never seen again. The Stripling school records and the testimony of many of the students who knew Oswald at Stripling could have exposed Harvey and Lee. Harvey and the Marguerite Oswald imposter left 126 Exchange in April 1955. It appears they moved to 120 North Telemachus Street, which is just off Canal. Now, when I researched the land records of 120 North Telemachus, I was astonished to learn that this property was owned by a woman named Margaret Keating. Margaret Keating was the first wife of Robert E. Lee Oswald, the father of Lee Harvey Oswald. In January 1956, while Lee Oswald was working at Two Jacks, Harvey Oswald worked briefly at the J.R. Michaels Company. Now, what's interesting, I visited the J.R. Michaels Company. I met with Nick Mazza, who was the manager and then the owner of J.R. Michaels. And I asked Nick, I said, Nick, did you know Frank DiBenedetto? He said, sure, Frank and I went to lunch almost every day. I said, well, could Lee Oswald have worked up there and for you at the same time? That's impossible. He said, they're right up above, one floor above us. No, it's impossible. So that told me that it was Harvey working for Nick Mazza. while Lee was working upstairs for Two Jacks. In the spring of 1956, while Lee Oswald was working at Two Jacks, the Warren Commission tells us that Oswald worked at the Pfister Dental Laboratory. None of this was true. In reality, Lee Oswald worked continuously for over a year at Two Jacks, while Harvey attended Warren Easton High School and then worked briefly at J.R. Michaels. He never worked at Pfister's in 1956. The day of the assassination, Two Jack employee Jimmy Hudnall told me that the FBI arrived that afternoon. Lee Oswald's payroll records and pay stubs from Two Jacks were confiscated by the FBI and disappeared. But the Bureau knew there was a problem. School records showed that Harvey Oswald had attended Warren Easton High School from September 10th through October 10th, 1955. And the Bureau knew that Harvey had worked briefly for J.R. Michaels in January 1956. The Bureau soon realized that the only time one Lee Harvey Oswald could have worked for Two Jacks was after he quit Warren Easton on October 10th. The Bureau then carefully selected time cards which appeared to show that Oswald began working at Two Jacks after he dropped out of Warren Easton, but before he began working at J.R. Michaels in 1956. The FBI had now merged Harvey Oswald's school records and employment records together with Lee Oswald's employment at Two Jacks. The FBI then took photographs of Oswald's attendance at Warren Easton, photographs of his time cards at Two Jacks, and photographs of an FBI interview with J.R. Michaels' office manager to the Warren Commission. Neither the FBI nor Warren Commission produced a single payroll check, payroll tax records either from Two Jacks or the state of Louisiana. Finally, it is very important to realize and remember that all of Oswald's Social Security records from his employment at Dolly Shoe, Two Jacks, J.R. Michaels, and the Pfister Dental Laboratory have disappeared. On October 15, 1956, Harvey Oswald enlisted in the Marine Corps. He was 5'8", 135 pounds, and gave his home address as 4936 Collinwood in Fort Worth. Now, the Collinwood address is very, very important. It's important because that's where Harvey Oswald and the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Robert Oswald lived in the summer and fall of 1956. This shows you that Robert was very, very involved. On October 24th, Harvey and 3 other Marine recruits boarded an American Airlines flight to San Diego. Oswald and the 3 recruits from Dallas were assigned to platoon 2060, along with a young man from Wisconsin named Alan R. Feld. Following boot camp, they were transferred to Camp Pendleton, California for infantry training. They shared the same tent, and Alan Feld and Harvey Oswald spent a lot of time together. Feld told the FBI that he and Harvey Oswald were together in California until May 1957. Following the assassination, the Dallas police found a 7-page handwritten account of Oswald's background. Harvey wrote that he had served in San Diego, California from October 56 to April 57 and Camp Pendleton in April and May 1957. Alan Feld's statement to the FBI, Harvey Oswald's handwritten chronology, and Marine Corps unit diaries confirmed that Oswald and Feld were in California during this time. But Harvey Oswald and Feld's assignments in California contradict with both Marine Corps records and the Warren Commission, who said that Oswald was in Aviation Fundamental School in Jacksonville, Florida in March, April, and May. Lee Oswald. In the fall of 1956, while Harvey Oswald and Alan Feld were stationed at San Diego, Lee Oswald was stationed in El Toro, California. It was here that 2 Marine Corps sergeants met Private First Class Lee Oswald. Sergeant Wallace Ransberger worked with Lee Oswald in San Diego and a year later knew him in Atsugi, Japan. In early 1957, Sergeant Donald Goodwin was assigned to the 5th Marine Division at Camp Pendleton and supervised Private First Class Lee Oswald, a radio communicator. The statements of these 2 Marine sergeants is important because according to the Warren Commission records, Oswald was never a private first class and never in the 5th Marine Division. In February, Lee Oswald took leave Following his leave, Lee Oswald was assigned to Aviation Fundamental School in Jacksonville from March 18 through May 2nd. After graduating, Lee Oswald and 5 other Marines left Jacksonville by train for Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi to attend radar school. Harvey Oswald attended the same radar school, but at a different time, a different class, and a different course. Harvey Oswald and Alan Feld were transferred to the Naval Air Technical Training Center in Memphis, Tennessee, where they were stationed until early September. According to Marine Corps records published in the Warren volumes, Oswald was never in Memphis, Tennessee, not even for a single day. Yet Alan Feld told the FBI that he and Oswald spent 3 months in Memphis. The Warren Commission dared not interview Alan Feld, whose testimony could easily have exposed Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald in the Marine Corps at the same time. And they dared not ask the FBI to interview Marines who knew and bunked with Oswald at the Naval Technical Training Center in Memphis. In September, while Lee Oswald was aboard the USS Bexar en route to Japan, Harvey Oswald and Alan Feld were still in Memphis. In September, Alan Feld was transferred to Opelika, Florida, while Harvey went to New Orleans. Alan Feld's 10-month association with Harvey Oswald was now over. The FBI's interview of Alan Feld was published in the Warren volumes, so the Commission knew about Alan Feld. They could have identified and questioned Marines who served with Harvey Oswald at the Naval Technical Training Center in Memphis, Tennessee, while Lee was in California, but they didn't. Harvey Oswald and Alan Feld's assignments directly conflicted with the assignments and whereabouts of Lee Oswald. This is the reason Alan Feld was never questioned by the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, or the Assassination Records Review Board. On September 12th, Lee Oswald arrived in Tsugi, Japan, aboard the USS Bexar. Harvey left the Marine Corps in Memphis. He was soon working at the Pfister Dental Laboratory directly across the street from the Hotel Senator, where he met Palmer McBride. On October 4th, the Russians launched Sputnik, the first satellite into orbit. On this day, Harvey Oswald and co-worker Palmer McBride began discussing Sputnik and Russian space successes. McBride was an 18-year-old high school student and had been working part-time at Pfister Dental Laboratory for 2 years. Palmer was a member of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association, a group of high school students who met regularly on the second and fourth Saturdays of each month. McBride and Oswald became close friends and spent a lot of time together, both during and after work. McBride visited Oswald and his mother in their apartment at the Hotel Senator, which is directly across the street and about 30 feet from the dental laboratory. During one visit to the Oswald's second-floor apartment, McBride met Oswald's mother, who he described as short, heavy-set, gray-haired, and not too friendly. Harvey Oswald visited McBride's house on several occasions, where they often listened to classical music. McBride and Oswald went to the movies together and attended the Boris Godunov Opera. This opera played only twice in New Orleans, on October 10th and 12th, 1957, and both McBride and Oswald were there. In October, while Harvey Oswald was working at the Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans, Lee Oswald was stationed in Tsugi, Japan. Lee was assigned to bunk on the first level of Barracks 5, a large 2-story wood frame building that housed 72 men. Zach Stout remembered the day that Lee Oswald arrived. He and Oswald became close friends and worked together on a daily basis for the next 10 months. I talked with Zach for hours on many occasions. When I asked Zach if he ever saw Oswald read or study Russian, he laughed, and he said, "That's ridiculous. Who makes up these stories?" Lee Oswald never spoke a word of Russian in Japan, nor was he a supporter of communism. Lee Oswald never studied Russian in high school, junior high, or grade school. Harvey's ability to read, speak, and write Russian when he first arrived in Santa Ana, California, is the key to understanding Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald. Yet an Oswald shows up at Max 9 in Santa Ana, California, and suddenly understands, speaks, reads, and writes Russian. And now their 19-year-old Marine was making preparations to defect to the Soviet Union. Some of the Marines who served with Harvey Oswald at Santa Ana also served with him in Taiwan. But most of these Marines remember Harvey because of his interest in anything Russian, which included newspapers, records, and politics. Harvey had less than a year during which to convince fellow Marines of his devotion to communism in preparation for his upcoming defection. Nelson Delgado, Irwin Lewis, Camillus Brown, Buddy Simcoe, Mac Osborne, Neil Tessum all served with Harvey Oswald during October, November, and December 1958. But during this time, Lee Oswald was still in Japan. The only Oswald who was ever at Max 9 at Santa Ana was Harvey Oswald. Lee Oswald arrived at the 5,000-man Jet Air Base in El Toro, California on December 22nd. Alan Graff told the FBI that he was Oswald's platoon sergeant. Warren Commission attorney John Hart Ely interviewed Graff, who told him that Oswald never studied or spoke a foreign language and was not interested in communism. Graff said that Oswald enjoyed firing a rifle and was rated a high expert shot with a rifle. Now, what did the Warren Commission do about Harvey Oswald at Santa Ana and Lee at El Toro? The Commission ignored the jet base and Marines who served Lee Oswald at El Toro. Instead, they focused their attention almost exclusively on Marines who served with Russian-speaking Harvey at Max 9 at Santa Ana. They interviewed anyone and everyone who remembered Harvey Oswald's fascination with communism and everything Russian. They were trying to find a reason or a motive for Harvey Oswald murdering President Kennedy. A photo was taken of the tall, husky, well-built Lee Oswald by his friend George Wilkins shortly after he arrived in Japan. Another Marine who knew Lee Oswald during this time was Richard Bullock. Bullock remembered that Oswald was not in the radar section, but was a radio communicator. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, Richard Bullock told family and friends, "The Oswald I knew was not the guy I saw shot by Jack Ruby." Bullock looked at the mugshot of Lee Harvey Oswald taken to the police station shortly after he was arrested and said, "It looks nothing like him. That's not the man I knew in Japan. The Lee Oswald I knew was 30 to 40 pounds heavier and 3 to 4 inches taller than the man accused of killing President Kennedy." Richard Bullock was not asked to testify before the Warren Commission, House Select Committee, or the Assassination Records Review Board.
I saw the records that the Oswald, the real Oswald of the Marine Corps, was taller, eyes different, scars on his body was different.
Then the Oswald that came out,
that was killed by Jack Ruby, certainly.
The Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald said that he never spoke about communism, was not interested in politics, never studied or spoke a foreign language, occasionally got into fights, and was always drinking. Peter Cassisi said Oswald came back from leave several times completely drunk, and Jerry Pitts recalled one night when Oswald was passed out drunk in the parking lot next to the barracks. On October 27th, Richard Sear was standing about 15 yards from the barracks and it sounded like a gunshot inside the building. Zach Stout was also there. Sear and other Marines ran into the barracks and found Lee Oswald sitting in his locker with a nickel-plated Derringer laying nearby on the floor. Oswald, with little emotion, said, "It seems as though I've shot myself." Lee Oswald was taken to the hospital at Yokosuka, where a Navy surgeon closed his wound with stitches and allowed the slug, which lay just below the surface on the back of Oswald's upper arm, left arm, to remain in his arm. A week later, the doctor made an incision on the back of Oswald's arm, removed the slug, and closed the wound with stitches. The shooting resulted in 2 scars in Lee Oswald's left arm above his elbow. It was Lee Oswald who had these scars, not Harvey. Neither of these scars were noted by Dr. Earl Rose, who performed the autopsy on Harvey Oswald after he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby in 1963. On November 23rd, only 20 hours after President Kennedy was assassinated, FBI agents arrived at the Pfister Dental Lab. They confiscated employment records and financial records which disappeared. They interviewed 10 employees and instructed each one of them not to discuss the case among themselves or with anyone. James Harrison Vance, who knew Harvey Oswald from both the Dental Lab and the Astronomy Association, was interviewed at length by the FBI. Vance said, "They really shook me up." At the National Archives, there are no payroll records, no canceled payroll checks, no tax withholding records or any record from the Pfister Dental Laboratory. And all payments made to the Social Security Administration by Pfister Dental Laboratory on Oswald's behalf have disappeared. McBride. Within hours of President Kennedy's assassination, Palmer McBride met with Air Force security officers and told them about his association with Oswald. The following day, FBI agents interviewed McBride for hours. McBride gave the agents a very detailed account of Oswald in New Orleans in 1957-58, which was published in the Warren volumes. But because McBride knew and worked with Harvey Oswald for 8 months in New Orleans, while Lee Oswald was in Japan, he was never asked to testify before the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or the Assassination Records Review Board. Can you imagine what would have happened if McBride had testified before the Warren Commission? Lee Oswald in Japan. The FBI and Warren Commission interviewed only a few Marines who knew Lee Oswald in Japan, and not one of these Marines knew him well. The FBI simply ignored all of the Marines who were close to Lee Oswald in Japan. Not a single one of Zach Stout's group of 10 Marines who bunked with Lee Oswald, worked with him on a daily basis, traveled with him, and went on leave with him. The Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald better than anyone, not one of them was ever interviewed by the Warren Commission. Today, we can only imagine what the Commission's response would have been if Richard Bullock testified that the Oswald he knew in Japan was not the same Oswald killed by Jack Ruby. It is important to remember that Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald in Japan were never interviewed by the Commission. But dozens of these Marines who knew and worked with Lee Oswald in Japan were interviewed by author Edward Epstein. Epstein's interviews and notes were held for years in the Special Collections Department at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. My research friend, Malcolm Blunt, visited the university and asked to see these interviews. Malcolm was told they're not available to the public. A few months later, another research friend, Jones Harris of New York, knew Epstein's publisher and called him at my request. Jones asked if he could have access to these documents. The publisher then telephoned the university and was told these documents have disappeared. Somebody's lying. Is it Marina? You know, I visited Marina at her house, talked to her on the phone, you know, months after months, days after days, hours after hours. And I just always assumed that, you know, Oswald spoke Russian with a Baltic accent, blah, 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 blah. And everybody who listened to her, you know, we've all got to say, oh, Oswald spoke Russian with a Baltic accent. Well, how do you know that? Well, I've read it here and I read it there. Then I go down to Argentina and talk to the people who lived with the Oswalds next door for a year and a half, and as an afterthought, as an after comment, by the way, Miss Zeiger, how well did Oswald speak Russian? And she looked at me like I just asked her to undress, and, you know, big eyes, and what? He never spoke Russian. I said, wait a minute. And she threw me for an absolute loop. I was momentarily stunned. What do you mean he didn't speak Russian? And I said, he didn't speak Russian. No. Not a word? No. And then she said, my father always interpreted for him. And I said, he didn't say, das vidanya, niet, nothing? No. So I went to the hotel that night. I spent hours in bed rolling that over in my head. What's going on here? And I finally realized that, so Oswald didn't speak Russian in Russia. Of course he didn't. He's a spy. Well, if he didn't speak Russian in Russia, what language was Marina and he talking? My God, English. And then, of course, the question would be, where the hell did a 19-year-old girl in the middle of Russia learn to speak English? KGB. And then I thought, I need to confirm this. And I talked to Dick Russell one time, and Dick said, I'm going to interview Robert Webster. Would you like me to ask him any questions? I said, yeah. Ask him if when he met Marina, if she spoke English. And Dick came back and said, yep, she did. Broken, but she spoke English. That's enough for me. They were speaking English in Russia, not Russian. There's a video of a guy on TV, a Russian guy talking about Marina, saying that she slept with the Afghan ambassador. She needs to be sent her. She's been overlooked. poor widowed lady for a long time. Let me tell you, she was KGB. And we really don't know who Marina was. We know what's been told to us. We've been told she's got an uncle in the MVD or something, and her mother died when she was... We don't know that. She told Robert Webster that her mother worked in an office factory or something like that in Moscow. She lived with her mother. We really don't know Marina's background at all. It could be anything. Now, don't forget, Marina tried to get married to Webster. She tried to have a relationship with him. And she secretly went to Leningrad. She told Oswald she was going to Odessa, but she went to Leningrad, and she just happened to be staying in an apartment in the same building as Webster was in that huge city of Leningrad, and meets him again. And he doesn't want to have anything to do with her. So, you know, she then simply goes back to Oswald.